Roger was a person who always treated everybody else with dignity and respect.
He always gave us the respect that we gave back to him.
A strong character, a strong personality.
He connected with people in ways that most people can't.
His kindness, he was a nice guy. Everybody liked Roger.
Roger was huge in the journalism field. I mean, we're talking, I mean, he was the Walter Cronkite, the Edward R. Murrow. I mean, he was a huge person in journalism. It wasn't just his impact in Fresno. He had impact, nationally.
He was editor-in-chief of UPI. He had also been bureau chief in London and Rome. He was a news manager in Europe. He was involved in a number of professional organizations.
I figured his career ran about 58 years, which in anybody's language is a long time for a career.
As president and editor of UPI, he directed their coverage on some of the biggest stories in the world on a daily basis. I mean, in our small way, we had a chance to touch greatness.
The quote I heard often, especially when Roger died, was that he was a newspaperman's newspaperman, and that it was so true with him.
Then he became a professor of journalism at Fresno State, and then when he retired there, he came over and wrote a column for us at the Fresno Bee, and so he offered his insights into how things worked. He was the idea behind the Fresno Little Hoover Commission that went back and forced the city to re-look at all the problems and issues they had in a very comprehensive way. He wrote a column that suggested this Little Hoover Commission, patterned after the state's Little Hoover Commission. His columns reflected his understanding of life.
I think he'd like to be remembered as a man who taught by not teaching. He set examples for people. He respected people. He treated everybody with such incredible dignity.
When Roger first came to the department, there was a buzz. Students were excited. This was a well-traveled, quintessential journalist. And if you took a class from Roger, man, you were getting something special.
I think Roger was different as a professor because he was just a neat person. He understood, and he was just nice. But he was demanding. I mean, you had to produce. You didn't get a free ride with Roger. He knew that you had to earn your grade.
He said, Ron, make sure that your students write and rewrite and rewrite. And then he shared something with me that I still use to this day after 15, 16 years teaching in the department. He said, Ron, when a student writes a story, you need to think of it in 3 ways. And he said the lead is 1/3. Make sure that your student's lead really is effective and compelling, and award your students 10 points for that lead. And he said the second area is the body of the story, or the story organization, how your student captured that theme and developed it.
I remember the first big story idea that I took to him, and it was a story I did for Insight on Wendy Yoshimura. Wendy Yoshimura was a Fresno woman who got involved in the group that kidnapped Patty Hearst. So I went to Roger, and I had this story that UPI had done years ago about a woman who got involved in the Weathermen organization, another underground radical student organization at the time. And I went to Roger and I said, this story really inspired me, and I'd like to do one about Wendy Yoshimura like this. I'd like to find out, how did Wendy Yoshimura, this young, quiet Asian girl from Fresno, end up in this radical student group that that kidnapped Patty Hearst. He was the editor on that story, and I never realized that the initial story, which I believe won a Pulitzer, I know a number of stories he worked on won a Pulitzer. I didn't realize he was the editor of that story. I mean, he had edited it, and I can't, you know, he never mentioned it. And I found out about that later on. But I mean, that was the kind of modest person that he was.
He didn't talk 50 minutes in a row. He let the students engage him, and then he engaged them, as I understand it. I've met students who actually were students of his.
He was a great editor. He had such a light touch that there were times when you'd read the story back over and say, man, that's a really good story I wrote. But it was good because Roger edited it, but you didn't see his, you know, his voice there. He just helped you with yours.
What I would like to emphasize is this towering integrity of this young Armenian man who set an example not to be imitated, but it was who he was. He said that he was not a professional. I'm not a professional Armenian. By that he meant he was a citizen of this country, a citizen of the world, irrespective of his racial or cultural background. And he strongly believes that.
He changed people's lives in a lot of ways, and I think he made everyone a better person, which is really important. Here we're talking about journalism and skills and stuff like that, but Roger was just a good person. So if he changed people's lives, I'm sure it was being a better person. You know, right outside the McKee-Fisk, there's a special little area there, and you can walk and sit down at a bench, and there's a little plaque in Roger's name. And every year I make sure I take my students out there, and we sit down on those benches, and I tell them all about Roger, because they have to know. And even though he's been gone, hopefully they'll know about him and become a better person.
That he is a transformative figure when you start thinking about his example. I feel absolutely blessed to have known him because he taught me so much at a time when I thought I knew it all.
Despite all of his accomplishments, he was very modest, self-effacing. He was the consummate gentleman. He had a great deal of integrity, and he kind of passed those things along in a very subtle, quiet way.
This is a great honor for Roger, a great honor for the Department of Mass Communications and Journalism.
I'd say, Roger, thank you so much. I owe a lot to you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart.